we should be good now.
Yeah, I think coming through. Audio works on YouTube but not on Zoom.
That's okay. We wanted on
That's
that.
all.
Should be no one else connected to YouTube.
Yeah.
Let's just zoom in.
That's
We're on.
fine.
Good.
I don't know why it's not working on Zoom, but okay.
Okay.
Sweet. All right. Cool. Thanks for coming, everyone, and thanks for anyone who's tuned in and on YouTube at the moment. Just as I'm going through the first intro slides, make sure you go to brisphp.com/pizza, sign up for the pizza raffle. There's also an IntelliJ license in the raffle as well. So make sure you do that. Where there is a question there asking for talk suggestions, which we'll then put onto our GitHub for you. So then we can use that to try and gather more people to do talks. It's hard to find speakers because people don't think they know things. You say, hey, you should do a talk, and they're like, I don't really know anything. But if you say, hey, everyone likes to know about event sourcing. Oh yeah, I did event sourcing the other day at work. I can do a quick chat about that. So it really helps out. Thanks to our list of sponsors, which is getting quite large now. Mainly to Credit Sense, Nido, and EcoExchange, who provide all the beer, pizzas, or the pizza vouchers that we're giving away instead of pizzas these days, plus the event space, which we rotate between those three. Recilbro provides myself and Tom as organisers. Tom has ditched us tonight because he is settling on a house. And he needs to get his priorities straight. I told him that, but he wouldn't listen. And most recently to JetBrains, who are now providing us free IntelliJ licenses. I guess we'll do it the old-fashioned way. Make sure you follow us on Twitter and jump on our GitHub and to request talks or to offer talks. Even better, if you have an idea for something you talk about, doesn't have to be super intense or even PHP specific, just anything that could be interesting to PHP developers. A lot of our most enjoyed talks have more to do with like the business side of things or like team building and that sort of stuff, which is not necessarily PHP directly, but it's quite interesting as well. We got hopefully 3 talks. Oh, Robbie's here. Nice, thank you. 3 talks tonight. I'll take the first talk. I'll just have a quick overview of what's happened in PHP in the last 3 months. Mostly just going over the new accepted features into PHP 8.1. Tom went over a few in the last meetup, so I'll go over a few more. And we've got James Harvey, who has disappeared out there for the moment. We'll be talking about high performance SQL, MySQL specifically. He's been doing a lot of stuff with scaling MySQL lately, and he's got quite a good talk lined up. And then Rob Wilde is going to tell us how to get your Git on and how you can kind of build a nice, clean, linear Git history with rebase and why you shouldn't be terrified of it. Like I know I certainly was a few years ago. I'm going to draw the winners later. So after my talk maybe, or during James's talk, I'll draw the winners and I'll announce them after that. So yeah, you've still got 5 more minutes or something to enter if you need to. So moving on.
Make it the website again for the kids at home.
BrisPHP.com/pizza. Here's the URL there. Just put /pizza on the end. Hopefully you guys can remember that. So, what's been new in PHP in the last 3 months? There's a guy that works for Packagist actually who every 6 or 8 months he runs through the Packagist logs to try and figure out what are the most frequently used PHP versions and libraries and things like that. So it's quite interesting to see kind of the increase in adoption of different versions and how much old versions are still being used. Like you can still see here, PHP 5.4 has still got almost 9.5–10% of usage. But the newer versions are definitely picking up traction quite fast. And then if we stick to the next slide, you can see each version as it comes out has a quick ramp up speed, except PHP 8 is very slightly slower. PHP 7 is almost the most used version ever, or that's 7.4, I mean, is almost the most used version ever. It's almost beating 5.5 at its height, so that's pretty exciting. I'm excited about that anyway, you don't have to do. I think you should be there.
Do you think the breaking changes in 8.0 are what's scaring people off from getting right into it?
No, I don't think there's that many breaking changes in 8. The hardest thing for me upgrading to 8 was all of my third-party dependencies that hadn't updated their compose.json. Literally, most of all I needed to do is go into compose.json and say 7.4 or 8, or do greater than whatever, greater than 7, which Symfony's moved towards as well. Because if they just say 7.x, then you just flat out unable to install PHP 8 and use it. Composer just says no, unless you do like nasty hacker and say, Composer, don't really worry about that, that's all right. But then like you're probably gonna run into issues with other things it's ignoring as well. So that I did recently upgraded to 8 myself. That was only a couple months ago, and that's just because I had to do like 4 or 5 pull requests to different random packages that no one had updated yet, and then wait for those to get merged. It's the whole thing. So I think that's the hardest part, to be honest with you. Anyway, once we get to PHP 8, then you can upgrade to 8.1 pretty easily. 8.1 will come out probably in November. They haven't set a date yet, but they have picked the release managers who then kind of, they set like the feature freeze date and the process forward as well. One thing that's quite interesting, although you probably will never have anything to do with it, is fibers, which is a really, really low level concept, which allows you to kind of do asynchronous stuff, but not really, because it's like fake async. So it lets you have one thread in PHP, but then run something, and then when it does like IO or when it's going to like request an external service, you can just kind of like take it off the CPU and whack something else on, whack another fiber on, so it does things. So if you imagine like in JavaScript land, you have promises and you do like 3 API requests, and then you say like await all, and you wait for them all to come back, but your CPU is doing nothing in that time. It's not like sitting in like a constant while loop, spinning around and things like that. So Fibers kind of does that. It's really, really low level, and it's aimed at PHP frameworks like AMP-PHP and React PHP. So it allows them to do more async stuff. They already do kind of hack around it using generators and yield and things like that. I'm not entirely sure how it works, but this kind of gives them a little bit more power and flexibility. It just so each fiber then maintains its own unique stack, so it's kind of like a whole separate like runtime almost. Whereas what they currently do with generators and yield, they have to like share state, and it's like kind of muddy. But there is a problem with that, is that most PHP IO functions are actually blocking like in the core. So like if you say like read a file into memory, or like get a HTTP request or something like that, PHP just blocks on it. You can't, and there's no way to say, hey, don't block on that, just like kind of sit over on the side. So most of the core functions in PHP won't actually work with fibers. So then you have to like re-implement the HTTP protocol yourself instead of using the core PHP functions, which is why it's kind of targeted at the lower level frameworks. But hopefully, potentially, things will become async in the future now that we have like a reason to do it. So here is like an example of how it could potentially look in something like React PHP. So you can do multiple requests, and then you have like await all and promises. So it's kind of, it could be very similar to awaiting all promises in. I should probably point at this screen so that that's kind of see that. That makes a lot of sense. Similar to like JavaScript land sort of thing. Yeah, certainly not as powerful as something like Go routines or anything like that. It's kind of like the first step in that process. Potentially they'll build on it in the future and make it a lot better. Oop, too many. Something else. Ooh, I copied that off of the my code sample is copied from the RFC. and I've got a no return as the type. The return type actually changed, it's called never. So it's very similar to void. It means that your function won't return a value, but also your function's just like execution will stop. It's not possible for your code to continue after this point. So you can see like here in a typical PHP application, like probably not using a framework, you might do something like this where you redirect using the redirect function, and then you have to like exit or die. And if you don't do exit or die, then it's possible that like your execution continues and you leak some data, and it's just not a good idea. But if you put the never return type, return that says never and not no return, then PHP will throw a type error and say, no, you're not allowed to do that, exception. And I mean, theoretically, you're throwing an exception, but at the end of the day, you want an execution to end there anyway. You don't want it to continue. So like an exception is not really that bad. The client who's reading that should have redirected by this point anyway.
And it's better for static interpreters as well, right? So
yes,
PHP Storm is going to know that there's nothing more to do, and it can, dim text.
Yeah, it's like if you have a return statement and you have code underneath it, highlights it, red, it says this is useless code, and it'll do the same thing here as well, because like you can't get there. So there's a lot of people saying it's kind of useless, but like I think it's great. It'll definitely help with static analysis and stuff like that. It just opens things up, and there's no reason not to have it really. Now also bringing in an fsync core function, which is very similar to flush. If you open up a file in PHP with fopen, you can use flush after you write to it, and what that does is it tells the operating system, hey, I want you to write my changes to the file system, but I don't really care if you do it, just do it. But fsync is saying, no, you have to write it to the file system, and I want you to tell me when it's written to the file system. So then once fsync returns, you know that your file is written to storage. And they've also brought in a fdatasync as well, which is writing the contents of the file, but not the metadata. So like access at, things like that you get in. Metadata there is in files. There's hundreds of things, but if you don't care about the metadata, I don't really know why you'd use fdatasync and not fsync, but I'm sure there's a reason. We also have a more explicit octal notation. So if you look at the first line up the top, in PHP, if you write 016, it'll actually interpret it as octal notation, which is actually 14. So like 16 does not equal 016, which is kind of annoying, and I've been caught out by that before as well. Like when you're like writing like file system permissions, and it always has to have the 0 in front. It doesn't have the 0 in front, and you're making it like 777 essentially, or something weird. And that still works. So this is not a breaking change. You'll still have your 016, but you've got these two other types of octal notation. So that's a 0 and a capital O, and there's a 0 and a lower O as well. And then that's like more explicit octal notation, so you know, and that can't be interpreted as an integer even when you read it. So that's pretty interesting. Oh, I found this super fascinating. Has anyone ever used the globals variable? Wow, I've never heard of it before, and it's fascinating.
Bit of an answer pattern sometimes. It gives a curse now.
Yeah, I mean, there's the super globals like $post and $get and those sort of things, and frameworks generally kind of wrap that in like a request object or something like that. But globals, if you look at this first bit of code up the top, when you define a variable called a, it gets added to the globals array. So you can access that variable through the globals array, and then you can modify it through that array. Why? Why does that exist? Actually, it exists because of historic PHP. It came in PHP 4, I think, because there's a bunch of reasons that I read the other day, and I cannot remember them. But the issue with that is that globals array internally to PHP is the same as any other array. And then any array functions you do, like array pop or array shift or just iterating over an array, it has to work for the globals array. And the globals array is still a little bit special. So there's a bunch of places in PHP code that is checking, oh, are we looking at the globals array? Then do this. Otherwise, do like normal things. And that is like pretty significant performance bottleneck into certain applications and things like that. So what they're doing, if you look at the first two code blocks will still work. The thing that they're stopping is you from changing essentially the entire globals thing. You can't say globals equals empty array. You can still access individual global variables, but you can't override the whole array. I don't know why you would do that. I can't think of a legitimate reason why you would do that. They actually analyzed the top 1,000 packages on packages and found it was only used like 23 times. So they're like, it's kind of backwards compatibility break, but we're just going to push it through anyway. So that was a fun one if you've got that sort of code.
Sometimes people are using it when they're doing like anonymous functions and they don't want to use a static instantiation of a variable or something, and they're throwing this stuff in there like, oh, look how clever this is. I didn't have to use or anything like that.
People will be doing some, it'll be like trying to hack around and like get around PHP limitations, surely. But I don't think it's ever been recommended to do something like that. And there's another kind of long-standing trend since PHP 7.2, I think, where they want to get rid of the resource type. You know, every time you do like, if you do fopen, and it gives you a resource, and that's just kind of like means like it's a large amount of things that could be. It could be a file, it could be like a IO, it could be a bunch of things. And they never added the resource type, so you can't have a return type on your function of resource. You can't type in a parameter as a resource. And instead of adding that type in, what they're doing is slowly going through all of the core functions that work on resources and making them work on an actual object. So if you look at like I'll point at the screen, file info, instead of returning a resource, it's going to return an finfo object, which you can then call functions on and do other things on instead of just treating it like a generic resource. So over the last few versions, they've been like slowly knocking off a few of these. I'm sure there's hundreds more in the code base, but they're just slowly migrating the whole way through until they can just get rid of resource entirely.
The benefit of that would be when you need to like serialize it, because you can't serialize a resource. So by creating an object, it gives you something you can actually capture.
Yeah.
If you need to store it or
and you can type into it a bit better than like I know that if I have a parameter type of GD font, I can't pass in a file into that. Whereas if you hinted it as a resource that you can pass in any sort of resource, it doesn't really help you very much. It's kind of like saying mixed.
Yeah.
It doesn't really do much. So there's also a fun leftover from the PHP 4 days, or PHP 5 maybe. All of the internal functions in PHP which work on strings can also, all of them I think, can just take null, like all of their parameters are just nullable. So that if you can pass in an array to like array map or something, you can just pass in null and it'll just continue on. And that's where you get things like returning false, which PHP does a lot of the time. And they're getting rid of that. The fun story behind that is internally they had types on the internal functions long before PHP 7. But there was like a decision made ages ago that they would just like make them all nullable by default. And then when they brought types into PHP 7, they didn't want types to be nullable, so then they kind of like, it's like kind of two separate implementations of types. But the internal functions allow you to pass in null instead of what you meant to pass in. So they're just getting rid of that and it'll throw type errors now, which is good. Love me some type errors. So that's all there is that's been added to PHP 8.1. There's a few more RFCs in there getting voted on currently, so look forward to that next time. Who's using Composer 2 yet? Okay, cool. Anyone?
Anyone on the stream?
Anyone on the stream?
YouTube, wait a second.
Yeah, while I'm talking about this, and then make sure you quickly type in a comment. So I would certainly recommend upgrading to Composer 2. I don't think there's any thing that will break. They don't quote me on that. I'm sure someone's using something that will break. But Composer 2 is like super fast now. I love doing Composer updates because it takes like 2 minutes instead of like 30. It's great.
Depends on your version of PHP.
Oh yeah, that's fair.
Gotta be above 7.2.
Yeah, okay. PHP version of 7.2. Yeah, I think 7.2 is the lowest supported one now anyway, isn't it?
No, 7.3 is. 7.2.
Yeah, okay. Anyway, so there's a couple of things Composer 1 is doing to kind of fix issues in the back end. New versions, if you publish a new version to your package, it won't be available for 15 minutes. And that's just because there's so many packages and packages that get updated so regularly. And Composer 1 has a really inefficient way of storing all that data. So they're only making it available every 15 minutes to kind of reduce load on their servers. And similarly, if the package hasn't been downloaded by anyone in the world for 4 months, you just can't access it on Composer 1. You have to, and then once someone downloads it with Composer 2, now you can access it with Composer 1. And that's just, again, they're just essentially purging all of that stuff out of their database. So that, to save space, because Composer 1 is just like super inefficient in how it stores data. But by and large, Composer 1 is still supported. They're still releasing new versions for it. They're just like slowly deprecating things, and it'll go away at some point. Xdebug, in their quest to monetize Xdebug, they've now brought out Xdebug Cloud, which is kind of interesting. It just gives you a public IP address, and you connect to your like PHP storm or your IDE to Xdebug Cloud, and you connect to your VM or your dev environment or your production environment, whatever you want to Xdebug Cloud. You just put in the public IP address, and they both connect through there instead of having to worry about things like firewalls or configuration with Maker and Docker and all that sort of stuff. I don't actually know how much it makes it easier. I know Xdebug is kind of a pain, but I think it will still be a pain as well. Like, there's a lot of configuration options, and like having the IP address is not the only thing that's an issue. But anyway, that's currently in beta, so give it a shot if you want, and let me know how you find it. There's a couple of security issues that popped up recently in PHP. I don't know if anyone heard, but there was a couple of malicious commits that actually got into PHP main code base. Someone like committed as 2 of the core maintainers. They sent up backdoors into PHP, committed them under the name of 2 of the maintainers. And initially they thought it was an account compromise, but it actually turned out that their master.php.net, which was running the authentication for their self-hosted Git, it was running like HTTP authentication, and then there was a couple of other constraints around that, which meant their passwords were stored as MD5 instead of something that's decent. So then their server essentially got packed, and anyone could just send up commits as wherever they wanted to. But that was found really quickly before any PHP codes were released. So unless you downloaded PHP from source and compiled it within that hour or so, then you're not going to have the issue. But to fix it, they essentially ripped out the HTTP authentication. They moved to GitHub as well, and they like fixed up their master.php.net, which was running a super old operating system, super old version of PHP, which is quite funny for people who maintain PHP anyway. And I thought there was another security thing, but maybe I missed that slide. Anyway, if that comes to me, I'll talk about it. But otherwise, does anyone have any questions, including on the stream? Someone wants to ask a question to give the stream viewers a chance to type. Okay then. Nothing on the stream yet?
Nothing yet.
All right.
Justin Nancy says evening all. That's it.
Oh, evening, Justin. All right, that's cool. Well, if there's any questions, I'll jump back up later and announce the winners anyway. So feel free to chuck them in, and I'll answer the questions then. But let's hand over to James Harvey. Jump back. And he can talk to us about high performance MySQL.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Both slides. Yeah, cool. Just checking.
Cool.
I'm gonna move to.
Can I be sitting?
It's gonna be super tall. There we go.
I can stand now? Cool.
You took further there.
Excellent. Thanks everyone, thanks for coming. So, as Nathan mentioned, basically last year or around last year, I was looking into some database stuff. Our CPU jumps around and all that sort of stuff, and basically wanted someone else to present a talk on MySQL and how to get a bit more performance out of it, how to optimize queries properly, all that sort of stuff. But no one came to my aid, so I had to run it myself. So that's what I've done. And now I'm going to present it back to the community. So just a little bit of, I guess, a primer, a little bit about Found You, what we do. Predominantly, I would say we're a payroll company with workforce management, utilities, and HR as well. So we are kind of an all-in-one system that does everything to mobilize and pay your workforce. So we have a rostering feature, we have a HR feature, we have a payroll feature. So some of the optimization issues that you'll have in one particular part of the platform are transferable, and sometimes they're not, sort of thing. So some of the examples will come straight out of that as well, just give you that context. All right, so database performance issue that creeps up on you. Basically, when you're a startup, super early stage, you're fairly hand to mouth on getting customers, getting people through the door, getting features built, all that sort of stuff. So your problems at that stage are finding customers, super fast development, and you're still working out what product market fit is. You're still trying to get what people want, and you're trying to build that thing. And so what you start out building, what you think you're going to build as a product, and what you end up building over the next 5 years is going to be two different things. And you're going to incur a lot of bloat, tech debt, product debt, all that sort of stuff. Scaling startup problems have all the same pressure from before, except now the stakes are much higher because people are actually paying you real money for your service. And you start getting bigger customers, more customers, and new issues start to arise. And that's definitely where the database scaling stuff comes in. So how did that emerge for us? Basically, we had errors, slow queries, app performance, all coming from the database. We have lots of other errors, but I'll focus on the database ones for now. And also super helpful internal bug reports directly to my Slack channel, which I really enjoy. These ones with no context as to what the error was or what's going on. Are we running slow? Maybe. Is your internet running slow? I don't know. But let's take a step back. So let's just humanize the whole process. Like, we all don't know how a system's going to scale and all that sort of stuff. We will, as developers, make mistakes when we design a database schema. It's just a fact. It's going to happen. We will think we know how MySQL is going to do something when it's got a few billion records in the table, and we will be wrong about that. And that's also okay, and that's part of the learning thing. And then we also need to ground ourselves in the reality that when you're dealing with these problems, because they feel not great to deal with at the time, and you feel like quite a silly billy at the time, we need to remember that the business is doing well, and this is just a good problem, essentially, to have, right? So we've got to remind ourselves of that. So let's take that context, that positive context forward. So what we'll cover tonight, optimization versus scaling, two different things. Optimizing a query, we'll go through that a little bit more in depth because that's the bit I try to focus on. We'll talk about transactions, some advice there, and then a little bit on database design tips. So optimization, what's optimization versus scaling? Optimization, fundamentally, we're trying to get the most out of a single server. So at some point in when your startup's taking off, you're happy to put down the credit card and just keep whacking a bigger and bigger MySQL instance on because that's the cheapest and simplest solution. And at some point you go, well, we're actually spending quite a lot of money on that every month, and potentially we get a little bit more bang for buck here. And that's when you're switching into an optimization phase, right? So some ways that we can optimize things, we're avoiding N+1 queries. So just a quick primer, N+1 queries, we're inside of a loop and we're making queries within that loop. Not a good idea, producing a lot of traffic to your database for no reason. Try and batch them up into one query. Fast queries, we want to try and get the most performance out of we actually want to find our slow queries and then make them more performant.
We want really fast transactions, and we want to avoid deadlocks. Scaling issues, which I'm not covering tonight, or scaling solutions are adding read replicas. I'm not going to cover that. That deserves a whole talk on its own. Splitting out database across clusters, and then of course sharding. All right, so I'm going to do an example, and we'll walk through the typical flow of an imbecile like me trying to work their way through a problem. So this is a very simplified data schema of our rostering system. I've removed the terrible table names and made them actually make sense. So hopefully you can follow along. Essentially, super high level pitch is we've got shifts. Shifts belong to rosters. An employee, there can be, multiple employees that belong to a shift, right? So you can have a shift that's from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. You got 12 people on that shift. That's fundamentally the schema, and I'll take that example forward in all of these examples. So I loaded up a database on like a 15-inch Mac 2018 model for extra context. So all these timers came up out of that, and I put 5 million shifts in it, 2,000 companies, 2,000 rosters, 2,000 employees. So first one, let's just start with the basic business requirement. I want to grab all the shifts on a certain date. I'm going to grab the ID, and I'm going to grab the start time. I pull out 5,000 rows out of my randomly selected data, and I get 3.21 seconds to pull that back. That's pretty terrible. You're definitely not going to want to make a user wait for that. So what do we need to do here? First, let's check explain. So we run an explain. So all you have to do is put explain, start your query, and then it tells you the query plan on what MySQL is going to do to try and figure it out. And it'll kind of give you a rough idea of where you need to look. So first thing, let's walk through these fields, or the important fields. Select type, simple is terrible, I'm pretty sure. I usually have to check the docs every time I run an explain because I'm, again, an imbecile. So I do that, I recommend that. For other people, they can probably have better memory than me. Table, this is the table we're looking at. So if you have a join, you'll see a explain with multiple levels to it. And then we've got the type, and so that's how it's going to find the records. The primary key, is it looping over a bunch of records? Is it able to find an index of some sort, so on and so forth. Possible keys, this is the index we could use. Key, is this the index we did use or will use. And then the other important ones for me are the rows and the extra, but most importantly, the rows. The rows are how many rows is MySQL going to have to probably traverse to fulfill your query's requirements. In this case, 4.94 million rows to fulfill my query. So that's not very efficient. So what do? We add an index. So we create index. We're going to create it on the start time because that's our filtering. And look at that. We're getting a lot better. So we're getting the same amount of rows, obviously the same query, but 0.89 seconds. So we're getting better, but still not great. So let's have a look at this query just a little bit further. So we're selecting ID and start time from shifts, but we're also saying where date function equals a certain date. So that's interesting. The date function or any sort of function in MySQL and other databases don't necessarily have this problem. But in MySQL in particular, if you use the date function inside of where, it's not going to be able to use the index properly. So you're running into a problem there. And this is much, I would say, cleaner than actually filtering on the full datetime string, but you're not taking full advantage of your index, so I wouldn't recommend it. So instead, we switch it out to a where and between two timestamps. So the start of the day and the end of the day, boom, we're down to 0 seconds. So we're fully utilizing the index now. That's fantastic. We're on our way. But a new business requirement comes in. We need to grab the end time now. No worries, we can do that. We'll just add it to the select. Hey, what has happened here? 140 milliseconds suddenly. I thought we were using the index. Why has it suddenly jumped up to 140 milliseconds? That is interesting. So what's going on here? And this took a little bit of reading, but basically this is the most succinct diagram I could possibly give. MySQL or InnoDB in particular is fundamentally a series of pointers that point all around the place, and they use something called a B plus tree, which is not a B tree, but it's slightly different, and to stand up. But fundamentally, we're going from our indexes linked to our primary key index which then links through to the data on disk. So in the first query back here, when we're just grabbing the ID and the start time, MySQL does not have to go anywhere past the primary key. It looks at the index, and then it looks at what you're trying to read, and it says, I've got all the data here. Why would I go to the actual hard drive and read what's going on there? But when we have the end time there, suddenly we can't use that index anymore, or we can use the index to find and locate the data, but we still need to go into the storage to find all the stuff. So that will slow it down a little bit. So we have two options at that point. We can cop the 140 milliseconds because we're probably going to be running on a slightly beefier server in production, and that's completely okay. Sometimes you'll do that. Or we can add end time as a composite index. And if we do that, which I've done here, boom, back to 0 seconds again. No 140 milliseconds at all, sort of thing. In the real world, you're probably not grabbing 5,000 rows of data. You probably need to paginate, but I'll leave the contrived example as it stands. So let's have a look. Now we've added a composite index, so I'll just quickly bring that up again. Composite index is on the start time and then the end time. And now the business requirements come in to say we want to search for the shifts that finish between that day, not the shifts that start between that day. Okay, no worries. So we have an index on the start time and end time, but it's a composite index. Now we're back to 0.9 seconds. So nearly a second just to find it on the end time, but we have it in an index. What's going on? Essentially, a composite index is stored left to right. So the order is actually really critical here. So within MySQL itself, it's storing your start time, because that's what we set first, and then it stores your end time next to it, almost like a concatenated string. And then when it's searching, it's still able to kind of use the index when it comes to the end time, because it can look at the index, but it can't fully use it, sort of thing. Like it still has to loop through a lot more than it should. So some more research that I did, because I swear that this worked in production, I wanted to show it to you guys, but it turns out MySQL is much smarter than me, is I wanted to prove that potentially when you start from the wrong table and you do your joins from the wrong table, you can get MySQL to slow down. I couldn't actually get it to do it when I did this. So in this case, we've got two examples. We've got starting from the companies. We want to find all the shifts that start between for a given company ID. The same filters on the other side, but instead of starting from the companies and then joining to rosters and then joining to shifts, I've started from the shifts and then joined to the rosters and then to the companies. So it's the same filters and the same data. They're both just normal joins. But I thought maybe MySQL's going to do something different here, sort of thing. It didn't. They both have the exact same query plan, which is below. So we can see we get a constant with primary key. And then we get it's got a company ID index that's using next, and then it finds a roster ID. So for that query, I actually really tried to contrive it too. So I set about 500,000 shifts to a particular roster and then tried to get it to do it. And when I filtered on that roster, I was expecting big data to come back. They both came back at the same time. They both had the same query execution plan, so I was wrong about that. So that's something. The 1.64 seconds, that's pretty slow. Not really happy with that. So what is going on here? The answer is actually in that query plan. So it's actually in the third row there. Possible keys is roster ID and the start end index, which is our one that we've been working on before, the holy grail of indexes. And what did it actually use, which is in the key column? It chose to use the roster ID. So we had this perfectly good index that we designed for it, and then it had the foreign key index that's just whatever, and it chose to use that one instead of ours. That's interesting. So let's make that other one a composite index. We add the start time to the roster ID index. Suddenly we're away in business, sort of thing. 0.08 seconds, fairly acceptable. So that's my super quick summary of indexing and query optimization. We can take that super far, but I was told to try and keep the time limit a little bit low, so I won't go too much further. But let's talk about some downsides of indexes, and then we'll move on to some other things. So some downsides of indexes, Indexes can grow, they can get really big, and they're also dependent on the size of your primary key. So if you use, say, GUID or some other ridiculous data structure as your primary key, then potentially your indexes are going to expand in size a lot more than if you use the auto-incrementing ID. So that's something to be aware of. And your index size actually does matter, not so much when you're small, but when your table starts to really grow. It's much easier to add an index than it is to remove it, because I don't know, maybe someone can tell me after this talk's over, but I actually don't know how to say to MySQL, hey, when was the last time you actually used this index in production? Like, can you tell me that? Because that would be helpful, because then I can go, well, it hasn't been used in 3 months, I'll just turf it. But right now, the way that I do it, which is black box, I think you don't use that index. And that's not a good thing. If you remove that in production on a Tuesday, which is peak payroll day for us, like you're probably going to have a bad time. So it's very painstaking to get rid of an index, but it's super easy to add one when you're setting up a table and think you kind of got it right and you actually got it wrong. And also your query plan changes over time, like the business requirements will change over time. And so what indexing you did at the start may not translate as well later on, and something that you'll have to pay attention to. Indexes can also affect the write performance. I should do some more research on that, on like what the actual ramifications are for having a bunch of indexes on the table, but I haven't. So that would be interesting as well. That issue has not really affected us that much, so I'm not giving it much thought. Transactions and deadlocks. This one is, yep.
How do you choose what index to make? Like, there's lots of types of indexes, and you can index any column. Like when you look at a slow query, what triggers you to make you think I'm going to index that column in this way?
Oh yeah, that's in the explain. So in your explain, like this one, you can see here, we've got ref is generally a good type. Again, I have to Google it every time what the different types are. If you have a all, that means it has to do a full table scan across it. That's a bad place to be. But the other deck giveaway is number of rows here. So we've got 1235 rows to find that. So MySQL basically has to, so let me just dig into that a little bit further. That's a great question. So with the indexes and all that sort of stuff, when I said that MySQL is basically a series of pointers that go everywhere, that's very true. And basically uses the B+ tree to get down to the data block, and then it will use more pointers that join the data blocks together to traverse. And so once it uses index to find the entry point, it starts there, and then it says, I'm going to have to scan from here to wherever until I'm sure that I've satisfied the query, right? So your table scans and all that sort of stuff that MySQL thinks it's going to have to perform to fulfill that duty is going to show up in the explain super clearly, especially if it's filled with data. So maybe some rough advice would be to actually pump some data into a table and make it show up so they're really obvious. And that way, when you make these changes and add indexes and all that sort of stuff, you're not adding it on empty table and going, well, I think the query plan looks like it's better. You can actually get a tangible feel for how that table is going to perform at 1 million records or whatever is expected for that sort of volume. So it's all in the MySQL explain, basically, we'll tell you that. And I'm pretty sure you can get a detailed MySQL explain, but I've never dove that far into it. Does that sort of answer the question? Yeah.
Just James, just on that, are you finding that you're seeking out the worst offenders and optimizing for the worst offenders, or are you doing optimizing for the most frequent queries? Yeah. So I'm a very lazy person. That's why I became a programmer. So I let MySQL tell me in the slow query log what is going on, what's slow. Usually what you'll find in there, so do you have read-write replicas, or do you just have a single master node of MySQL in your particular case? There's no MySQL on my project that I'm working on.
Yep, gotcha.
I'm working on something that I've never heard of before coming to this company.
Okay, got you. All right, well, if you have split out read and write into 2 different servers, you'll have 2 different slow query logs, and that will make it a little bit easier because you'll be able to say, these are my slow reads and these are my slow writes. But essentially check the slow query logs the first thing. I'll come to N+1 queries a little bit in a bit, if that's okay. But yeah, slow query logs. MySQL will tell you, okay, I could have done better here. You know, here's the log sort of thing. So for us, we just have that logging to CloudWatch from AWS Aurora, which is MySQL for AWS. And then we just check that once when a customer complains, essentially. All right, so.
There's also a question on the screen.
Yes.
Someone's asking, like, does the use of like an ORM, like Eloquent or something, does that help with reducing the number of wrong joins or help you make like index or anything like that?
Yeah, that's a launch me into a rant.
On the comments.
Okay, so that's probably actually a big thing. So I've tried to keep this agnostic PHP so far, but I will talk about Eloquent and ORM. That's what I'm really actually trying to highlight with that primary key thing. So with that index, what you'll see is when you use the index and you select out the primary key, it's blisteringly fast. But when you use an ORM like Eloquent, it just does a select all by default. And what you'll see in production code, not ours, jokes, you will, but what you'll see is you just get used to Eloquent just doing all the work and you forget that you've just selected back all the other fields. And then you'll turn around and you'll pluck out just the ID, please, and you'll turn around and stuff that into another query or do something with just the ID. But what I'm trying to highlight there is that if you select out the ID when you only need the ID and you're using ORM, you will be writing more efficient queries because it can properly just use the index. That's what I'm trying to say without actually explicitly saying it. So that's my issue with ORMs, that sort of stuff, is they do it just to select all by default. And sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. The other thing with Eloquent that we're getting into an interesting territory is I find that people push all ORMs way past what they're used for, like what they're best for. They're best for CRUD and simple queries and repeatable, simple actions, right? And I've seen some gnarly queries written inside of Eloquent, or on top of Eloquent. And then when you're debugging the performance of that query, you now have two problems. You go, what the fuck is Eloquent doing to give me that query? And then what's that query doing, sort of thing. So if you have a complex query, you're doing multiple joins, you're doing interesting things, or whatever you need to break down to get more performance, you got to drop the ORM and go straight to the PEO and just do raw queries. That's my personal opinion. And so an example for us is we ditched ORM in a lot of our routes when it came to rostering and approved shifts and all that sort of stuff that have a high transaction. It's just too heavy because Eloquent obviously does select all. You've got these really fudged up queries that they're just hard to debug the query sort of thing. And then on top of that, if you use Eloquent to search on its relationships, you run into a bad time as well, because it doesn't just do a join and then select out. Eloquent does extra magic on top of it sort of thing, and that gets really confusing as to why it's doing what it's doing. So yeah, I would say keep it separate. If you have a complex query and slowing down, I would say, or you have a complex query that's hard for you to read and understand what they're doing in an ORM, break it back to SQL straight away, and then you'll at least be able to debug that by yourself, sort of thing, without having to get it to tell you what SQL is producing or stuff. I could go into that a lot further, but is that satisfy the question, do you think?
Yes, we'll wait for YouTube's up there.
So you're sacrificing portability by going outside of this adapter.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
you're going, look, this is going to be easier to play with.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
streamline.
Yeah,
Let's handle it.
and I know that people like the idea of portability, but
How often are you?
when does that actually
changing?
Yeah, frameworks like ORMs because it gives them a wide access to a bunch of different databases. But once you've selected, you made that selection, how often are you running I don't know, MS SQL in your dev environment and MySQL in production or whatever? That's so rare. And you'll probably find that you'll have those weird bugs that just crop up when they don't, and it works on my local, and doesn't work in production. So you're more than likely going to be running the same database across everything, and you're more than likely not going to be switching database vendors. The only time you might want to stay agnostic, which is it's a different rant altogether, but I'll try and stay back, is if you're vendor locking yourself into someone like AWS, whether they're not an open source thing, so you're vendor locking yourself into DynamoDB, for example, and eventually you want the option to say, well, I'm not going to use DynamoDB forever, I might switch to something else. Then you might use some sort of layer that separates you and the metal, but you'll probably struggle to really optimize that because you're always fighting that layer, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
That's, yeah.
You got a yes and a thank you on the chat.
Good, good. All right, transactions and deadlocks. Is there any other questions?
I was just going to say anecdotally, I've noticed ORMs tend to like, they just create your foreign keys, your primary key indexes, and they kind of like hide this server from you. So I don't think I've ever created an index just because I've never worked on something that's got billions of records.
Yep.
Never needed to.
That's good in a way though, like you haven't prematurely optimized something and then had a bad time. But I would check the slow query logs as your adoption picks up. Like that's why it's not really an issue when you've got, like none of this stuff's an issue when you've got 2,000 records in the database. It's like, MySQL so fast doesn't care. Like it only becomes an issue when you got 500,000 or 2 million or 5 million or something like that. That's when it starts to creep up on you. So it's kind of like one of those issues that just sits under the surface. Yeah. All right, transactions and deadlocks. Now I wanted to go into the super detail, but I won't. I'll stay back. What I will say though is the key points. So the point of a transaction is not actually like business logic. Sorry, let me step back. The point of a transaction is to safely get the database from one state of change to another state of change. That's the point. And it's what people sometimes use it for is a business logic layer to prevent two bad things from happening. They'll go, well, database will tell me if I've tried to do the same thing twice or something like that. I wouldn't recommend that. I would try and see it for its natural point, which is if the server dies in between a transaction, will it come back to life and either be in this state or that state? That's the point of the transaction. So put that in your mind when it comes to using them. And when you see transaction issues, you should like probably be stepping back to your application layer and going, how do we solve it in the application layer? How do we avoid deadlocks in our application layer? Instead of relying on database to say, oh no, I couldn't solve this problem. So I'll just get into that a little bit more. So the thing that I didn't realize personally is that all inserts, updates, and deletes actually open a transaction. And MySQL opens a table, it opens a table lock and then a row lock. So it actually does two layers of locking. And then it has, well, this is InnoDB specifically. And then it has a queue with a read-write queue, and it can advance writes up the queue, and it can leave reads behind sort of thing. So the reads can get put behind the queue, essentially it can reshuffle its own queue. And so what you can get into is a situation where you have an unoptimized update, and that causes a deadlock of some description. So the difference is we have two different types that I've seen, maybe there's more, lock timeouts and deadlocks. So a lock timeout is specifically when a transaction stays open too long. And what you'll see in those particular instances is web requests coming in one over the top of each other, and there's just too many updates for a particular table. And that update is slow. It then basically buries itself, and one of the transactions stays open. MySQL is struggling to resolve it, and then eventually you get a 30-second timeout on the query sort of thing. So you should see that pop up in your bug snag or whatever you're using as your log monitoring. And then you go, boom, that's definitely going to be a slow query sort of thing. That's also the point that I check the slow query logs. But you will know when you see it, a lock timeout basically means slow query on an update. The deadlock is a bit different. Deadlock's quite an interesting thing. So in this particular case, we're looking at, this is pulled right out of an example. We're trying to update the same two records, but in a reverse order, and there's two transactions fighting to do it. And MySQL has basically picked it up and said, I can't service your needs as a transaction and your needs as a transaction because you both actually conflict with one another. It's not physically possible. I'm a deadlock and say, no, can't do it, sort of thing. So InnoDB in particular is quite clever at that sort of stuff. So when you're getting deadlocks, it's usually a business logic problem, which is where we hit them. We hit them in particular when we write new versions of payslip. We actually expire all the old versions of the payslip, so all the previous data inside of the payslip, which is highly inefficient. I wouldn't recommend it, but that's what we did 3 years ago. And basically, we can hit these deadlocks at that point. So we just put in an artificial barrier that says like only one at a time, and we've temporarily solved that issue, but we will need to address it further over time.
So you've actually talked about addressing things over time.
Yep.
Question on the chat.
Yep.
Maybe you can answer next bit.
Sure.
With the knowledge you have now, would you still use relational DB or go with NoSQL for OLTP and use MySQL for OLAP? In the past.
Yep.
What is OLTP and what is OLAP?
I don't actually know. Off the top of my head, I'm actually notoriously bad for only remembering the first three characters. Or
Real-time processing versus reporting.
Yes. Okay. I'll dive into that.
Maybe the first question. Your knowledge.
You guys are asking me really long-winded questions. With my knowledge now, would I choose MySQL? Absolutely. I think MySQL is amazing technology. I think it is like this, I suppose, boring technology that no one considers that much as being so integral, but it can actually scale up to billions of rows. It's open source. It has had a troubled development history over some time, but that's back on track now. I think it's fantastic. And I actually think relational databases don't get enough credit at all. And when it comes to, sorry, what was the two acronyms? Can you read them out?
OLTP for NoSQL.
Yep.
And MySQL for OLAP.
Okay, cool. Well, I don't know those super well, but what I will talk about is I've looked at NoSQL for ages, and I've looked at a lot of different variants. I played with Dynamo. I've looked at, obviously, Mongo came up in a time where I was maybe influenced by web scale marketing and that sort of thing. And they all seem promising, but NoSQL, how do I put this? There's benefits to relational databases that you get that you don't get with NoSQL. And you can't pick up one end of the stick without picking up the other. So what I mean by that is it's kind of funny, like it's two conflicting things. In our languages, in PHP and JavaScript, we now have TypeScript. We now have stricter types in PHP, and it's all going to a stricter direction. And then we got NoSQL in a different way. It's just like, do whatever you want, bro. It's all good, that sort of thing. It's like, these are totally different things. The other bit that I'll say is with NoSQL is you've got to be really careful with any new technology. If you're trying to use that at scale and you have no idea how it's going to scale, like, yeah, it's a huge amount of risk. So for me personally, I haven't not really hit a lot of business problems that I haven't been able to solve with a relational database. Maybe they've been slightly inefficient in some ways. One thing I will say is we're looking at pulling out that versioning I was just talking about. So when we write each version of the pay cycle, we expire all the data in the previous version. We'll pull that out. We'll put that inside of AWS S3, which is blob storage. Easy sort of thing. Like that's definitely a solution. I look at different storage solutions for different things, but I wouldn't necessarily just put down relational database and say, no, there's no use for you anymore because NoSQL is the hot thing sort of thing. I think that's what I would say. It gives you strictness. It gives you control over your schema. It gives you a way of changing the query pattern over time, which is really cool. In NoSQL, you kind of need to know how you plan on querying the data before you query it, all that sort of stuff. So yeah, and we don't do a lot of real-time processing where we are. So we're not an ad carrying company. We're not a social media platform that needs to do real-time. You know, like it's a different kettle of fish. If I was in one of those places and I was trying to run a trade for a cryptocurrency place or something like that, I'd look at different technology than MySQL. But yeah, for our particular case, it's fantastic. Cool. So keeping your database clean. So just some small tips, some things that I've picked up over time. Small fields are usually better. This is what I just talked about. So moving a text field potentially out into S3 or some sort of cheaper solution S3 is obviously eventually consistent, so you need to be wary of that. So if you have several writes in a row and try to read it straight back, you might get back the wrong thing. So it's good for like send it once and forget about it storage. Move out optional data into subtables. So if you have a table like you've got, I don't know, a description or something like that, and only 1 in 50 people actually write a description, don't put a varchar there with description in your main table. Instead, move that out to a subtable, because then MySQL is not allocating space on every single row to make room for that varchar, right? Just simple little things like that. They can reduce a lot of storage. Checksum data is key. So for our particular business case, we store a copy of the rates at the time on every pay cycle version. So that's the same data getting written to a text field every single time. And the cardinality on that data is actually quite low. So what we can do instead is just MD5 it and grab that as a key and say, based on this MD5, I'll use that as a key, and then I can put it inside a lookup table, and we've reduced the amount of duplicate data in our database. We are trying to get it released, but we've done that, and we've got it from a single 6 gigabyte table for one particular customer down to 200 meg tables. So it's a substantial difference. So you can look at the way that you actually store data in your schema and go, oh yeah, there's room for improvement here. Unsign your integer fields unless you absolutely need a negative number. That one seems obvious, just gives you more headroom. Consider storing dollars as cents instead of a double. This just takes up a lot less space, but you would need to move the business logic on how it reads it and all that sort of stuff out to the application. Keep the maximum number of joins and queries to around 15 or less. The high performance MySQL book that I read said to keep it on 12, but I've given you an extra 3 there just for fun. If you have flat reporting tables, then try and limit the number of hops from that table to get to the source display data, right? So example would be employee ID. You're not going to store the name in the flat reporting table like we do. That's a terrible idea. Instead, go keep that wherever it's meant to be. But make sure that when you report that data and you need to pull out the display information, that we're not going several hops through other tables to get there, right? That's a helpful one. N+1 queries, super quick. I've kind of talked about it a little bit more. So turn on query logging if you have it. So that's another benefit of RMs. They typically have some sort of query logging. Some packages can highlight it. So Laravel debug bar. I don't know any others, but that's the one. And then if you're using PDO or an old school system that doesn't have that stuff, just wrap the PDO object in your PDO object, and then ask your container to give that one out whenever it's used instead. And then what you can do is just basically put magic methods that link back to the original PDO stuff, and we can capture all the queries that run through. So we're in a debug mode, we go, okay, I'm going to grab all the queries. And the great thing is you will be using prepared queries, I hope, is that you'll be able to basically group on those queries. So you'll be able to say, well, there was 500 hits to select all from users where ID is question mark. Group that up, 500 hits in a single request, you got an N+1 query problem. And that's how you can find that sort of thing. So we just log that stuff in the dev environments constantly. They're just going all the time. People definitely check them, I swear. But it's just helpful sort of thing. We have a bit of a challenge because we're like half eloquent and a half old school PDO. So yeah, but I'll use this technique to get that stuff as well. References, I would thoroughly recommend finding slides and linking these references, having a look at them. Index depth and database indexing was a really fascinating read for me personally, because I was worried you guys were going to ask super hard questions that I wouldn't have the answer to, so I made sure I was actually prepared. And then also the high performance MySQL 4th edition in particular is a very easy read, really easy. Like it's, for a technical book, it was probably one of the easiest things. Probably also because I had a burning business problem that I was trying to solve, so I was going to specific chapters and going through them in detail. But yeah, great stuff. And then view IDs is generated columns, so that was great as well. So just put the best in there. About me, James Harvey, Chief Software Architect at Found You. We're hiring as well, so if you want to come and help me solve these problems, definitely hit me up. But yeah, any other questions?
curious what MySQL version you're up to. What do you
We're on 5.6 right now.
5.6.
Yeah, so there's nothing stopping us at 5.7. So because we use AWS Aurora, we're kind of like can't get to 8 sort of thing. So it's just a little bit about that, I suppose. That I think that as far as I'm aware, they kind of declared web scale MySQL, which was a consortium project between a bunch of big tech companies, as MySQL 5.6. And I have a feeling that AWS Aurora was built upon that particular branch of code, and that's why you don't get super recent like versions on it. That's what I think. I could be wrong though. So yeah, we'll upgrade to 5.7 soon. Don't ask me about the PHP version though. Don't, just don't. But yeah, any other questions? Cool, lads.
Just as a note, if you're looking for these slides, they'll be posted on the GitHub issue that James requested for this talk a year ago, and now he's satisfying his own talk request.
I can go back to and Stack Overflow and reply.
Yeah.
Mark answer.
Just like to add too that if you're looking for more detail about the indexing, there's a guy called Rick James that you'll see all over Stack Overflow, who he has written some really, really clever cheat sheets about how to make the best choices, why do you do indexing the way you do. And he's easy to find. He's all over DBA, Stack Exchange as well. He's one of those dudes that has hundreds of thousands of reference because he's been across the game for over a decade. I think he was doing database stuff before databases existed. He's been around. But yeah, there's plenty of stuff flopping around the internet to learn from, and I learned a lot from that guy.
Just quickly before we get Rob up to talk about how to use Git rebase, I'll announce our winners for our pizza vouchers and our IntelliJ license. So how are you going to present your talk? Have you just got links to your slides? Oh, you got your own laptop? Cool. You jump on that while this is why I'm doing this now, so we've got space to change over. So our pizza vouchers, we have Yuri, but your last name is Bartakstovich. Don't crucify me on that. It's quite enough. Sorry. Okay. We've also got Derek, no last name. David Hales, Jeremy Bartel, Samuel Levy, Mick Hanna, Ben Hood, Wouter, Josh C, and Jaden Lee. And then the winner of our first IntelliJ license is Bayard Kevin. Is that close enough? Yeah. Thank you. So yeah, you'll receive those in your email address. So thanks for filling out our form, and I look forward to looking at all your talk requests. And once we've switched over laptops, then I'll hand over to Rob to talk about getting Git.
Keep sure you can share screen and I'll go up. Share screen.
Forget my mouse.
The usual technical difficulties.
There it is.
You sharing your full screen?
Yeah.
No. On the.
Yeah, I'm
on the
just
Zoom?
just
Okay.
got to get my. once I get that. I'm not gonna send it out. I think I should read it now.
Yeah.
Share screen.
Good to go. Awesome.
The more value.
Hello, wonderful people, welcome. I'm going to try and enlighten you as much as I have been enlightened over the last 6 months to a year when it comes to using Git, specifically in an environment of other people. First, we have to celebrate Happy Geek Pride Day, which is today, to celebrate those of us who wear glasses. It's actually a real thing. It was created in 2006 by some guy in Spain to coincide with the release of Star Wars in 1977. It's a real thing. So a little bit of background. This has context, so it's very important. It's a beautiful photo of me. I've been doing technology in some form or another for 30 plus years. I started PHP in 2005. PHP 4 was a wonderful thing, but it scared me. So I went into sysadmin for Microsoft stuff until about 2015, and then everything went to the cloud. So I went back to PHP, and of course the entry level to PHP is WordPress. And then I switched over to the true light and God, Laravel. I now work for a company called Info Exchange. It's quite a large not-for-profit, been around for about 30 years. And I work on an application called SRS. Now, SRS is interesting because it was created in 2007, and there's a team of about 10 of us, and we've been working on the same application since 2007. And it's used by about 4,000 clients, NGOs, not-for-profits, a lot of government organisations now using Department of Health, Department of Housing, Australian Health and Welfare Institute, I think Department of Centrelink's using it a little bit, Queensland Police. So it's a fairly decent sized CMS, client and case management system. That's my Twitter handle. Had it for a long time. So Git and I, the story begins. So when I started doing WordPress stuff, around about 2015, I think it was, when GitHub said, no, you can't have private repos anymore. We're going to make you pay for them. So I went to GitLab, and I thought I'd become really awesome at Git and start doing MRs and all that sort of stuff. GitLab has a thing they call MRs, merge requests, whereas in GitHub, pull requests. Never really understood the whole pull request thing because you're pushing, but anyway, that's neither here nor there at this moment. So I started in an office alone. It's the key important thing. So everything was like one branch, everything's in master. I really didn't have any MRs. Why? And it's basically nothing more than a save with history. But you know, it's an SDN. That's kind of what it was built for back in the day. And I think in a one-man band, that's not too bad. But I moved into an environment with, like I said, at the time there was 5 devs. Now there's 9, going on 12 soon. And there's a lot of information. And I made mistakes. Now, has anyone ever seen this website before? I'll show it briefly if I can. It's called Commit Logs from last night. I'll scroll it quickly. So you get a gist. I don't want to stop on any one thing. So these are actually collected on a daily basis. And the only reason you can pick one is because of the profanity in it. And it's live and always updating. And the best ones are the ones that you see from people at early hours in the morning. And let's face it, I think at some point in time, especially when we work on our own projects, we've done a commit message somewhere like, you know, I changed it, I fixed it, I bloody fixed it again. I don't know what it's doing. Screw you. And, you know, it happens, but at some point in time, you've got to get nice and neat. And I wanted to show you some commit history from something I created at Info Exchange when I first started. I had to do a small change. It was 186 commits. And I was wondering why they weren't happy with what I did. I can't show it, unfortunately, because of recordings and stuff like that. So what I did was I created just a small kind of example of how MRs shouldn't have gone. I wish I had more time to build this. It's only for an editor. I couldn't use the other stuff today, so unfortunately it's not huge. But yes, so as you can see there, we have a branch, create a feature, and I have a commit message. You can see the commit message is down on the lower right-hand side. Really good descriptive commit message there, created the controller and the other things. And as you can see, the files that were committed in the upper right-hand side, there's a lot of them. And I don't think a lot of those pertain to specific controllers and things. And as you move through, it's kind of a really good example of the first merge request I did, where it was made a change, updated that thing, updated the thing again, more updates. I missed the squiggly thing. And I still see a lot of this in other places. I was going to say at work, but I can't. That's not nice. And maybe a little bit at work, maybe a little bit. Especially when you're doing a merge request. It's not too bad when you're actually making the changes yourself, spend a lot of time on something, you commit it, you get into that habit of, I've got to save it, and then you put it in a merge request and someone reviews it, and they're like, no, I don't like it. You change it, and you put it back, and then something breaks, and then it doesn't pass CI, and you change it, you put it back, and then you end up with, I changed it, and I updated the thing, or I changed the thing such and such said so, and it gets a bit, it doesn't get a bit messy, it gets very messy. So imagine that times 100 on a general basis. It gets really hard to understand what's happening, especially if you're looking at someone's Git blame. It's a great name. PHP Storm's great for it. You can see what people have been updating in the past, and you will go through and be like, updated the file. And that's not really helpful a lot of the time. And you've really got to step back through a lot of history to see what's actually happened. So I came across something wonderful. Atomic commits. It's such a brilliant idea. I don't know why I didn't come up with it myself. Probably because I'm not that smart. But anyway, so the idea of atomic commits, single irreducible unit. Every commit pertains to a single change. The idea I follow, it's not overly always simple to do, but when you make a commit, that commit could be pulled out or changed without affecting any other commits. That's the primary premise. And to make sure that is the case while you're working, each commit, you should be doing tests. Each test should be green. You can pull out a commit and the test will still be green. Again, not easy to do, but it's not really as hard as you think it might be. And they're clear and concise. So you make sure you put in a good message. Although most of the time it's not necessary, I have a tendency to use the file name in the commit message because it makes it easier to track and trace things, especially if you've got a big feature, you've made a lot of commits, you want to fix them all up, which I'll show shortly. It's easy to find out which files which that way. And I don't think there's any such thing as too much information. The standard rule of thumb, I think, is 50 characters or so for the first title in a space, and then you can put detailed information down below, which is about 200 characters. But I don't think there's any reason why you can't make it a little bit more or a little bit less, or it's really good. I like to use it for the detailed information for the other developers. We update tickets, most people probably do, but tickets are for the rest of the company. The sort of really sort of simplified explanation of why you fixed and what you did. Whereas I think commit messages are really good for the developers and get down into the nitty gritty. This is guide rule. So atomic is good because less time with merge conflicts. Now, has anyone ever tried to pull in dev or another branch and it's just gone, sorry, there's a merge conflict, and you sit there and you go fix, and okay, no, fix it again. No, I've got to fix that one again. No, that file, I've got to fix it again. No one's seen it before? It happens a lot, especially when you get into that habit of committing files over and over again. Every time that file's changed, it'll merge conflict and it causes a problem. So atomic will prevent that from happening a lot. Makes code review a lot easier. So if I haven't really done a code review before in GitHub. GitLab's great because you can go and you can look at the actual file, then you can look at the changes, but you can actually look at the commits, and you can actually control through and just look at each commit and see the files that pertain to that commit. And you've got a good little heading at the top, and it makes it nice and clean and easy. You can just go through instead of looking. I had to update Laravel. We're currently using Laravel 5.5 about a year or two ago, and I upgraded it from the Laravel mixer to the Webpack stuff, and there were a lot of files changed. I think in total there were about 21 commits. So, and each one was very specific to updating the Docker file, updating the package of JSON, making changes here. So it made it really clean. You can go through and just read them very easily instead of trying to look at the change list, which is huge. And it makes your history more relevant. You know, breaking down that branch and seeing what was done in a branch for the history, the Git history for a particular file, and see where it was changed and why it was changed. Again, like I said, we've got a very large application. It's very old. Half of it is, well, almost half is Laravel. The other half is legacy. Some of the Git blame will say 2012, 2010, and some of the files might be 2,000 to 6,000 lines long. It's just unfortunately the way it is, but we're slowly getting there and making changes. I like to fix things, so I enjoy it so much. The age-old question, merge versus rebase. Does anyone use rebase? And you're happy with it? A lot of the people, I'd spent a long time thinking I should create something for this, and I found this wonderful website. I hope he doesn't mind I borrowed it, but it's just the simplest diagram ever. Because I find that, especially when I started learning Git, I have a tendency to make things go like upside down and backwards, and you can't follow it very well. So, but basically, rebasing allows you to keep your history very sequential and in line, instead of sticking everything you changed and putting it all back into one. Now, eventually, so the thing is, at some point in time, you are going to push it all back into one, because most people will merge back into develop or master, but that branch will stay nice and clean and concise, and The important part I've found is when I'm working on a feature and developer's been changed by all the other devs, rebasing that back into my branch to make sure that when I push, everything is nice and beautiful is the most important part. And if I keep all my commits nice and clean and there is conflict somewhere, it happens, there'll be one file I have to change and that's it. Instead of change that file, change that file, change that file. So let's see some clean commits, just a few cleaner ones. So I did just a standard sort of post controller and with a model and a migration, if you know Laravel, like an MVC type of simple. Again, I wanted to show the Webpack changes that I made with the several hundred files and changes and just the 21 commits, but there were some issues with that. So I had to quickly make this. But as you can see here, it's got like I may have to make a change to the composer file. So very quick, short message with the file information and then a little note as to what you did. And then created a migration. Now a post and a migration kind of go hand in hand. So they're committed together. The post controller, it can be put into, again, it's sort of like a guide, a rule. Updating the post controller with some routes. So you create a test, the test goes with it because you need one to do the other, and it's easy to follow. So unfortunately, it's pretty simple to follow once you start looking at it a little bit more basically. You group everything. So you can the good thing about Atomic is you don't have to do it while you're working. You can do it at the end before you push, before you merge, before you do your pull request. And that's where get rebase I comes in. The I stands for interactive. Now, I definitely want to take a note out of the previous talkers, James. I am also a very lazy person. Which is why I use PHP Storm for pretty much everything. And when I started doing this some time ago, I was actually doing it in the command line because that's how it was taught from where I found it. But PHP Storm is actually very, very, very handy. Because so this is your get log in PHP Storm. It usually sits at the bottom. It's pretty easy to find. I used Alt-9 to bring it up. I'm looking at my branch. It's currently the one that's loaded. You can see it here. It starts there and it's got 4 commits. I can just go down here and go interactive rebase from here. And I get this wonderful window that's just a tad too big. Let's make it a little bit smaller. So now I can see my commits. And I can click on them. And I can see the file that's in the commit and the messages. And they're a bit rough. So what I can do here, miss the squiggly thing. Well, that's probably something to do with that one. So you have fix up and squash. Squash, I think most people have used. You squash commit, it takes the message, actually it appends it to the previous message, kind of like commit AM, and then adds them together and makes one commit. Fix up is fantastic because it just makes the message go away. It makes that commit go to the other commit, and it didn't exist. They're both all in one now. I use it probably more than anything. So if you've changed several files and all the changes sort of pertain to each other and you want them all to be in one commit, you just fix up, and it's wonderful. I think I fixed up the wrong one. That one's the post controller, that one's the post controller. So we can take that one there and we can fix that one up. And this one's a bit of a mess. So what I can do here is I can stop and edit that one. And that'll allow me to make some better changes. So now I can go over to my local changes and it should allow me to continue. Now I've only got 2 commits. I was going to fix that one up. It's actually stopped right at that point in time. So I could actually, this is that one, yeah, that one. I usually go through and do like and undo commit and move them around. If I feel like one commit probably should come before the other one, you can actually just drag and drop. Makes it pretty easy. Do a bit of rebase. It'll want to merge some things because I've made a mess of stuff. It should give me that one right there. Rebase successful. It's pretty intuitive, pretty easy to follow. The Git rebase I has some pretty simplistic commands. It actually brings up a nice in the command line. So if you want to go back the last 5 files, Git rebase I head 5, it will show you a nice interactive layout. Basically it's a VI file, and you just go through and edit the VI file, and you'll change each commit message to do you want to edit it, do you want to fix it, do you want to squash it. You can stop and edit, and then it just runs through and lets you change each file. So it's a little bit more, I guess, work, unless you're like a command line sort of ninja. But again, I'm lazy. PHP Storm does it all for me. And it actually shows you in the console too, exactly the commands that it's doing. So if you want to, you can run it that way, see the commands in the console in PHP Storm, and get a bit of an idea of what's happening there. So as you can see, sometimes you don't need to go back all the way. You might just need to go back a couple of files and make a few changes. The most important thing in the world when you're doing rebasing is if you're going to push, you have to force it. And that's where I first made my first big error when I was doing this, is that I'd do a merge request and I'd find out I need to make some changes. So I'd get it, I'd rebase it, and I'd make it all interesting, and I'd push it again, and there'd be duplicates everywhere. And it was a mess. So the most important thing to remember is anytime you have a rebase, force push. Use the force loop. Very important. I've gone through basic stuff. Now, pretty much everything that I've covered so far tonight, I found from a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful online person, developer from Europe, Pauline Voss. She did a talk, I think in 2018, on Nomad PHP, Git Legit. I kind of stole the name a little bit, but her talks and her blog are just invaluable for when you start doing this sort of stuff. I also found some really good information on a few websites that do a pretty good, sort of not too complex, but pretty simplistic sort of explanation on the differences and the benefits of rebase to merge and how and why you should use them. Again, it's not rocket science, it's just programming. And I think the most important thing is when you're doing rebase, force push, and you should be fine. So I hope that was informative. Thank you, and good luck with your Git.
Well, there's a couple of comments on Facebook. So someone's put a comment in there. Also, I use the library based local development before I do an MR. Yep.
Before and after.
Yep. That's their sort of comment. And it basically said that once other developers are involved, found the structure, or is it not?
Yes.
That's sort of you're aiming for.
Yes, that's the whole point, is trying to keep it nice and clean. Always programming for somebody else to read your code to make sure that if they do, I just put a nice message there. There's the reason for it. So yeah, once the slides are available, those links, especially Pauline's stuff, will definitely put you on the right path.
Do you have structure around how your team works on different branches? Because I know if you force push a branch and someone else is also working on that branch, then kind of all the whole branch.
We do it's kind of a Git flow method, and we have a develop branch that we all work off, and you pull a ticket, and that ticket becomes your feature or your bug, and then that branch is yours.
And no one else.
No one else works on it, and then when that gets merged, somebody has to review it, and it's merged back into develop. And then we start creating release branches for hot fixes.
Yeah.
So we don't have to worry about that too much. It's just sometimes, because it's such a large application, and there's just so many things that could overlap, it's that one time when you try and merge and it's like, no, he's changed here and he's changed there. And yeah, you try and do a commit and you push, and I forgot to reinforce it, and it's like, okay, now I've got 300 commits. I don't know what to do with.
I thought if you rebase and then push, doesn't it just get blocked? Or is that maybe it's a GitHub thing? And like if you try and push after rebase, GitHub says no, you can't do that. Because it's changed.
Without force?
Does GitHub not prevent you from doing that? Just lets you-
No, it seems to be pretty loose in that sort of case. Like it's GitHub's awesome because it updates. I like it because it updates all the time. They're always improving it, making it better.
Yeah.
And it's probably the only SaaS that we use for development that gets updated all the time. So I haven't accidentally done it for a long time.
Yeah.
And if I did, I can roll it back quite easily now. The stuff in PHP Storm makes it really easy to visualize your Git and your history and wherever it is and where it's overlapping. So it makes it easy. I like it.
Thanks, everyone. Well, that's all we have tonight, and there doesn't seem to be any other. Oh, there's a couple of comments on YouTube actually. Yes, we will be adding all the links to slides and stuff to the specific GitHub issues on our GitHub. So if you jump on GitHub, the issues will probably be closed by the time you get there. But if you just go to close, then you can look through for the specific issue, and I'll be posting a comment with a link to the slides and whatnot. So you should be able to find them pretty easily. Also, fun fact: there's like a history of all of our other talks with slides if you wanted to have a scroll through.
I was just going to say, can you do a shout out so folks on the stream and looking at it? When you're looking at issues, feel free to add in topics for new topics, new things that you want to learn about.
Yes, that's a good point. When you are looking at our GitHub, please add more issues, as many as you can think of. If you have a talk, if you're like James and you're struggling with MySQL, NoSQL, anything, please post an issue, request a talk, and then a year later when you figure it out, come back and give the talk. And we have another comment here. Should BAF if you have changed commits that have been pushed? Yes, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Where GitHub, if you try and rebase and push, it just says no, you can't do that, and then you have to force. I know I've run into a few issues before of I force push and then I've forced push through a branch and I've lost my changes, and you've got to like dig through the ref log and go, try and pull it back. But you feel like it gives into once you get into the ref log and like pull your changes back. Anyway, thanks for attending tonight. Thanks for tuning in to the live stream as well, to everyone who did. And this recording will be live on our YouTube as well. If you wanted to re-watch it and listen to any of the great talks tonight. I think that wraps us up.
I'll just ask the group before we splinter out. I was talking to a few people before we started. I'd like to know if anyone has taken any PHP courses in their lifetime and had a good experience or bad experience. The lead developer and owner of our company has found that there are some grants that are available at the moment, and they have a deadline in the next week. And he was thinking, well, if we can apply the grant, get a few $1,000s, upskill the dev team, that would be a great thing. So he's kicking around things like Udemy, which I've seen casually everywhere. And there's actually a local state-run or Brisbane-based thing called nobleprog.com.au that is offering courses as well, and they are thousands of dollars. So
Yeah, you need CodeStream, you need Laracast, and there's like 5 or 6 really good trainers on YouTube that do just a banging job. And some of those guys have gone to Laracast.
well, just for the record, our project has no Laravel in it, and there's no Symfony in it.
Okay,
So I'm actually interested in like design patterns and architecture. I'm personally interested in that. Not that that's what the rest of the team wants, but that's what I want.
Yeah.
And
Head first.
yeah,
Thanks for listening, you want.
In our class, we still have a series on design principles
So-
and that sort of stuff, where we have the other stuff where it's relevant, but I do have just PHP courses for there as well. Yeah.
Linda, which is now LinkedIn training. The guys that wrote the head first design patterns and principles, they rewrote it just this year, and they've actually done a course that matches it. And there's also a guy on YouTube who did a PhD in computer sciences. He actually did a 2016 book and did like 12 one-hour videos on YouTube going through every single chapter. Thing to remember is that both of those books are Java, but it doesn't really matter because it's about the principle.
you're right. So are there any, from personal experience, I'm specifically asking, has anyone had a bad course that they say, don't do this and here's why? Have you ever had a stick up?
There's some course in the LinkedIn learnings. Yeah, there's a bunch of courses because I got the premium for LinkedIn course, the
Yeah.
premium for the LinkedIn, but most of them is not good.
Why are they not good?
Like, for example, like last year I started to Laravel,
Yeah,
but there is like stuff called I don't know. I just followed that course, but it's very old versions. And also I tried to some composer working, but it's the composer working in new versions. But the courses are pretty old. And
right.
and
That's my
also
concern.
one more thing is like especially for JavaScript, there's a lot of dependencies.
Yeah.
But there's some courses I'm trying as much as possible the new one because the dependencies always mismatching and always like struggling with some basic things like some dependencies, some of the different libraries.
Right.
So like LinkedIn is good, but it's too much courses. Yeah.
Okay. I'm hoping for something that's a bit more intimate than someone just having a canned course that they just go, they push in front of you and they go, this is what you bought. Teach yourself this. I'm hoping for some actual educator to be part of it, but am I gonna find it? I don't know. I can teach myself my whole career, like this is how it has been. I would like to break out of that for just once and actually have like a teacher, mentor, person, human being.
I'm sure you could find like a consultant or something that you would say, hey, we're having this particular problem. You said using CodeIgniter, like we're having these issues with CodeIgniter. You go and find a consultant that does CodeIgniter. They could potentially like build you a course that meets the requirements, get you grant, and they can come in and be like, hey, this is how I would solve your problem. And then you essentially have a consultant that the government's paying for. So I don't know if that's possible. I've never tried it. I don't see why you could do it.
Can I ask also if anyone has even heard of the LinkedIn certifications for PHP?
Yeah.
Have you heard of it?
I like
Apparently there's like millions of people that have already done it.
but is it valuable? Because like
Well, it must be one step higher than an endorsement, because an endorsement, I could go to your link and go, oh man, he is really good, I know this and this and this and this and this, all the way down to.
I had to move my Linda stuff just recently, and I actually let me export all your certificates. I've got like 45 certificates in different courses. I can't remember what I did.
Right.
One's in there for Dreamweaver.
Very relevant. Have you got that one in the CV still? Or?
I was like, should I import them to LinkedIn? No, I don't think I'll import them to LinkedIn. It doesn't really matter.
Stuff that's like AWS certification, ethical hacking certification, like Linux, sysadmin, Windows sysadmin, that's the stuff.
Probably the best place I think you can go to Nomad PHP. I've been yelling at them for ages. They've got like paid courses, and for ages you click the course and go nowhere. Now they've actually got them. API, PHP, like fundamentals, and security, and they give you certificates, stuff like that. And it's like an industry sort of standard per se. It's like, Nomad's been around for a long, long time. So saying you've done a course there, in your test course and stuff, I guess it's gonna have more standing, because like doing an AWS course, you do it through AWS, and it's certified through AWS, so either Zen, Nomad, PHP Architect, that's been around for, I did a course with them in 2004, over dial-up, out of Canada, to that was fun.
Right. All right, well, we'll see how it goes. My boss is pretty interested in cashing in on this grant. Maybe I'll get stuffed into one of these courses, and I'll let you guys know how it was, but I like the idea of supporting local industry. So if there's a local course, I'd like to give that the nod, but it's thousands, as I said, versus Udemy, which is like $10. Yeah.
It's true.
Yeah.
There's also, I've looked at Secure Code Warrior before. It's kind of like a game that you get all your developers to play, and it essentially gives you like vulnerable code that you don't have to go on and you get points. It like gamifies it, and like here's the vulnerable code, find the vulnerability, and then get the solution, and then you can like pitch all your developers against each other and have like a leaderboard and all that sort of gamification stuff.
Exorcism.io is another one.
Okay.
It's a great name. And it downloads, it's a command line application, it downloads, and you can go through and pick anything from Java to C++ to just raw PHP, and it gives you a test, how to solve this problem, you do it, it's got built-in tests that you run to raw PHP, and it goes back, and then they have people who will, go through and curate it and see how you did, and you can get harder and harder and harder. Team.
Yeah, right. Yeah, personally, I'm pretty comfortable with reviewing code and finding anomalies and insecurities and things like that in isolated sections, but it's the design patterns, the architecture, and I'm often going, this is the way I know, let's use that.
Yeah.
And then that's because I don't know how to set up a factory pattern. So is that the right choice for this? I don't know, I just use this one. It's like if you're the golfer, you've got a 7-iron and that's your club. And so how do I know if I'm making the right club? You got one in the back.
Yeah.
Design patterns are like mid-tier concerns. You're actually looking at architecture patterns. Because that's your roadmap. So you look at domain-driven design, things like that. And then they drive, they're implemented via design patterns. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if you're looking at mid-tier, you're going, what design pattern do I use here? You kind of like, you can't see the forest for trees. You can take a step back, go a little bit higher. I say that with a completely undesigned system. So, like, take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
But that's where I'm going now. It's domain-driven design or something of that nature. I can't find any alternatives to it. And then stepping down from there into implementation, which is the difference. Yeah. So architectural patterns is actually what you care about, and then design patterns.
Yeah.
It's just necessary implementation.
Right, exactly. So writing code that works, I do that already, day to day. What I want is that sexy code. Sexy code. And I like to stand back at it. Yeah, I wrote that.
You just speak for yourself about writing code that works. And always do. All right, that's cool. Thanks, everyone. We might turn off the live stream now, so you don't have to listen to us chatting about random things.
That's part of the meetup.
It is part of the meetup. We're just trying to bring you guys in.
So we'll do more cameras next time.
More cameras. Yeah, we should get the room stream as well.
Thanks everyone.